I know that most of you here know him, but just in case that you're here for the first time, I'll just tell you a little bit about Dr. Lisle, who is the psychologist for the McDougall Wellness Program, and he also teaches and he sees patients at True North Health Center, both in Santa Rosa, California. And Dr. Lisle is also the co-author of The Pleasure Trap. And I think he is working on a new book, but we won't talk about that yet. And he is also the founder of the Esteem Dynamics. That is a wonderful website, and please visit it. It is esteemdynamics.com. I will type it in a minute. And it's a website where you can get more information about the ideas that Dr. Lisle talks about in all his lectures. Also, for people who might be interested in making a phone consultation with Dr. Lisle, you can get it from there. I know he blocks some spots every week to do this, and I cannot encourage you enough. Sometimes a half hour with Dr. Lisle is one of the most revealing and amazing moments that you have, and a brilliant mind. I admire him so much. So anyway, from any questions that you have about Dr. Lisle, you can also email him at drdouglysle@yahoo.com, and it's DR. You don't have to spell the whole word. Dr. Doug Lisle @yahoo.com. I will type all this in the chat box. So today we have a very interesting, and I know you will all love the presentation that he's going to give us. I want to welcome Dr. Lisle. How are you doing, Dr. Lisle?
It's a pleasure, Gustavo. Great to see you again. Very good. What we're going to talk about today is going to be willpower, and sort of the strange concept that willpower has only been a word in the English language since the late 1800s. So as important as a concept as it is, it's funny that it didn't even quite have its own word until fairly recently in our history. What we're going to be doing is taking a ride on learning about both the science and first the sort of a theory about trying to understand what willpower is, and then the science that really took off in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, which gave us a new look about what willpower is really about. So that's what we're going to do. So the main idea that the lay public has about willpower looks kind of like this, and that is that if you've got a problem that needs this amount of willpower and you only have this amount of willpower, then somehow you're not going to fix it. But if you have a problem that needs this much willpower and you have this much, then you'll be able to fix it if you apply yourself. It's going to turn out that very reasonable assumption is largely untrue. And so even though there are elements of truth in it, it's going to be a serious misunderstanding of how willpower works. And so we're going to be unpacking that so that at the end of today, we will understand what willpower is and how to summon and keep our willpower at its maximum to solve the problems that we need to solve. All right. So we'll begin with the first slide.
Are we ready to launch the slides then?
We're ready to launch the slides.
All right, here we go. Just give me a second. And
all right, here we are. Everybody knows what that little thing is, of course, but we'll get back to that. And let's go to the first next slide. All right, so everybody knows that this is, of course, the Apollo rocket. You can tell by the distinctive markings. And if we ever were to meet another species out there in outer space, the first thing that they would ask us is, what's your greatest achievement? And we could tell them all kinds of things, but probably this is what we would tell them. If you had to summon up human spectacular advances in history, this has sort of got to be the big one, that you actually left your planet and you figured out how to do it. So it took millions of people together, working together to do this. It actually took, the national defense of major countries is usually about 2% of the GNP. This took like 6% of the GNP for several years. This was a massive undertaking, done without email and done with, phone calls and letters and very primitive computers. To organize such a thing really tells us the story of what human beings are capable of if they put their mind to it. On the other hand, well, there's that other thing in the corner. We're going to get back to that. All right, next slide. All right, now here's 3 people that we're going to look at in terms of their individual willpower. We've already seen that humans in general seem to have an extraordinary ability to do things if they put their mind to them collectively. But let's look at these individuals. Turns out that the guy in the middle is Sigmund Freud. Now, this extraordinary man had a problem, and that is that he had little cancers that would grow in his mouth. And when they cut the first one out, it turned out that it wasn't long before he had another one. And they had to cut out another one, and it wasn't long before he had a third. And this kept going on for years, and at the end of his life, he had had over 30 surgeries on his mouth and had to have a prosthetic jaw put in. Now, this is at the same time when it's suspected that the smoking has something to do with this, and yet he won't put down the smokes. Now, this is quite a challenge and an interesting paradox for somebody who has the will to be a world-class scholar and was sort of self-styled most insightful human to ever walk, theoretically. And yet he's lost when it comes to this really perplexing self-defeating problem. The guy on the right, that's Winston Churchill. You can tell because he's holding up his V for victory. And this is a guy that had no lack of will, basically told Hitler that his British people were never going to surrender under any circumstances, and just face down this monster. And yet, he had a problem with alcohol. And in fact, historians have said it wouldn't be fair to call Winston an alcoholic because no alcoholic could possibly drink that much. So this is a man who had literally the weight of his civilization on his shoulders. And yet this was a habit and a go-to coping device that he couldn't get himself out of, no matter how much motivation there would have been to do so. And on the left, you're going to see this is Oprah Winfrey. This is also an extraordinary person that had enormous popularity and influence over television and other media in the United States, and the world. And with 20 million people watching her every day, hanging on her words. Yet the big embarrassing thing in her life is she had a problem with her weight and couldn't manage to get her diet act together. So when you're looking at these 3 extraordinary people, all of them struggling with a problem that should require willpower, if there's a willpower deficiency in these people, we've got a problem. So we're going to now look at the nature of how willpower works and a new conceptualization of the nature of this problem. Go ahead, next. Go ahead, next slide. Now, this is a dung beetle, and what this guy does is he rolls up balls of dung and stands on top of them. And of course, you can tell by it that it's a male. And the reason you can tell by it's a male is he's standing very proudly at the top of the dung heap. And there's a reason why he rolls up balls of dung and stands on top. Go ahead, next slide. And that's because this is how he attracts mates. It's going to turn out that up in the sky there, that's the Milky Way, in case you didn't know. And the dung beetle orients its behavior around the Milky Way, just as people do, interestingly enough. I'm not even sure that's true, but I read that on Wikipedia. I just thought I'd pass that along to you today. But the difference between the dung beetle and the humans is that the dung beetle is going to be doing everything by very short-term thinking here. In other words, and the choice mechanisms that he makes are very stereotyped and narrow. So he doesn't have the ability to think through the future and to think through, if he takes a drink, this is going to happen, or if he eats this, that it's going to have an impact, or if he lights up a smoke, that this is going to happen. In other words, his behavior is being guided by very short-term, simple considerations. And so, in effect, he doesn't have what we would call willpower, in the sense that he doesn't have to override one impulse and map out a future or a couple of alternative courses of action, and then essentially override the short-term impulse to do something in order to do what's in his best interest long-term. He doesn't have that kind of computational device, but humans do, and so do other creatures. Go ahead and next slide. So now this is a Thompson's gazelle, and what we're going to do is we're going to investigate for a moment Sigmund Freud's one of his many ideas, and the idea that he hypothesized to be the cause of his inability to put down the smokes. Now, his famous idea is what's called the ego and the id, and to him, the id is this sort of wild horse that is pleasure-seeking, and it just wants to do what it wants to do. And the ego is like the rider of that horse. It's not nearly as strong, but is reasonable and tries its best to try to keep the wild horse from doing crazy things and self-destructing. Now, this is what Freud is going to be thinking about himself and other people when he sees self-destructive behavior. This is a very interesting idea, and it has resonated with enough people to make it this, a bedrock of psychodynamic psychotherapy and an awful lot of literature. This idea makes a lot of sense to people. But we're going to now look at the ego and the id and that concept from the vision of biology as opposed to just psychology speculating on things. So now we're going to look at, this is a Thompson's gazelle, as you can tell by the distinctive markings. This one happens to be quite happy. This is in this grasslands of Africa, and we're going to now see what it does. Go ahead, next slide. What this guy's going to do is he's going to hang out with his other Thompson's gazelles. And you can see that they're all quite a bunch of happy group as they eat their grass and they run around and they mate, have kids, and that's what they do. But we know that life isn't all rosy, that there's usually some negative things in life. And of course, there are negative things in life for Thompson's gazelles. And go ahead and next slide. There we see it. So in the back, we see this ferocious cat of Africa. Some people thought that it was a lion, but actually that's just because they don't appreciate the artist. You can actually see some spots on that thing even from this distance. This is a cheetah, and this guy's got to worry about this cheetah. And so when he's eating his grass, which is pleasurable, every time he looks up, he checks out how far that cheetah is. And let's suppose he grabs a mouthful of grass, comes up, and the cheetah is 500 yards away, not a problem. Gets another mouthful, it's 400 yards away, still not a problem. Gets another mouthful, it's 300 yards away, still not a problem. Gets another mouthful, and when it picks its head up, the cheetah is now 200 yards away. Now, what's going to happen is interesting. The gazelle will now stop eating and start trotting the other direction away from the cheetah. And you might think, well, big deal, of course, it's not earth-shattering news. But it should be earth-shattering news to psychoanalysis, because the short-term self-indulgent thing to do would be eat another mouthful of grass that you want to eat. But that's not what the animal does. The animal shifts its gears and brilliantly, like a Rolls-Royce transmission, changes its behavior and does what's in its best long-term interest. So it quickly sacrifices short-term interest and goes for optimal long-term interest. And if you watch them, They don't have any great cognitive dissonance about this. They don't have an id riding their ego in angst, and they desperately want another mouthful of grass. Nothing of the kind. In fact, the concept of this, that there would be such angst and torture and terrible, harsh decision-making processes that would often fail, makes no sense biologically whatsoever. It's really bad biology. If you have an animal that is capable of computing its long-term best interests as it sees a threat, then it should be able to seamlessly shift to defensive reactions without any cognitive dissonance over the problem. In other words, why have the ability to compute your long-term best interests if you have a hard time executing it? Makes no sense, okay? So actually in this very simple demonstration, we can crash the notion of psychoanalytic angst in the way that it has been portrayed, in the last century. Now, suppose, however, we did something. Suppose that what this guy really likes is the fat that's in the alfalfa grass that it's eating. And suppose we get ourselves some alfalfa oil and we pour it all over a section of the grass. And so it's really, really rich food, unnaturally rich food. And so it's hyperactivating the dopamine circuits inside this thing's brain that are designed by nature to pick up on those calories and be excited about it. Now we're going to find that this thing may have a problem. Go ahead, next slide. So now what's going to happen is at 200 yards, this thing is going to have a fight on its hands, that its brain is going to want one more mouthful of this super rich grass that's so exciting. But at the same time, it may not, the alarm bell gets drowned out now when the cheetah gets close. So this is now the nature of the problem that Freud was having, and Winston and Oprah and everybody else. The problem is not that the thing has an uncontrollable urge system that is inherently self-destructive. The problem is that if we alter the environment unnaturally, then despite completely excellent equipment for making good long-term decision-making in the face of short-term inducement, suddenly the animal's in trouble. So whether the animal is a brilliant, will-filled human like Winston Churchill or Sigmund Freud or Oprah Winfrey, it doesn't make any difference. If we tease the system with supernormal stimuli, we wind up with a problem, okay? And their will is relatively weak at managing it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here's a human that would be fine living in its natural habitat, except that if we give it a bag of chips, we all know what's going to happen. Before it ever picks an apple out of that tree, the chips are going to be gone. Despite whatever the person might want to, in theory, pursue its, quote, best healthy interests, this is going to be a fight for that nervous system to deal with. Next slide. So what we're really seeing here is that willpower is the problem of dealing with the short term versus the long term and being able to integrate the best overall interest of the organism, which this thing is absolutely designed to do naturally. But we see in our modern environment tremendous numbers of challenges that will actually make this difficult. So go ahead, next slide, please. And so here we have some challenges in the modern environment that look a little funny. And that is the person wants to go on a diet, which is a totally unnatural thing to do. It's to try to essentially eat a limited range of the foods that are available and try to get themselves to eat the foods that are of modest caloric density and stay away from the foods that are not. And yet we've got other neural impulses that are basically writing circuits that say that the right thing to do is to eat the richest food in the environment. Those are natural circuits that are screaming at the person to indulge themselves as much as possible. Those things are now in a hefty contradiction, and the person's in cognitive dissonance over this, and it's difficult. It's also true that in the Stone Age, you couldn't save any money. It was impossible. There was no such thing as money, and it couldn't be saved. And so in the same way, in the modern world, it's difficult to save as much money as we would like to because it's not part of our nature. And yet we can, and people do, but they also have impulses that they want to use those resources immediately. Otherwise, it feels like they're being wasted. So they also want to go on a vacation. This is called having money burn a hole in your pocket. And if you've never had that experience, then you're sort of an odd, highly conscientious, very emotionally stable person. Almost everybody I know, with a couple of exceptions, we know who they are. Yeah, I've had this feeling, and of course, such a feeling would be natural to want to indulge that. All right, go ahead. Next slide. All right. So what we're really seeing here, for those of you that have read or heard me talk about the pleasure trap, we're now seeing these three main pillars of motivation as they sort of battle it out. And this is how motivation is going to be adjudicated in the mind through a balancing act of pleasure-seeking, pain avoidance, and energy conservation. So we're going to see that in this case, pain is going to be on both sides of the equation, where we've got the positives over here on the right, which are pleasure and future pain avoidance. And on the left, we have the cost of the pursuit of behavior, which is going to be energy expended and possible pain. So we're going to see that these four variables now battle each other. So if we see like a young person, a 14-year-old doesn't want to go to the dentist. And the reason is it takes some energy to do it, which it's really, suppose if they had to spend their own allowance to do it, now you could really forget it. It's also painful. There's no pleasure in it. And all the great value of going to the dentist is actually future pain avoidance. And so it's future pain avoidance against the energy and the pain. This is going to be not very enticing to do. But if you have a bigger brain and have more life experience and you can map out the total cost benefit analysis, then you'll get yourself to the dentist once in a while, even though it costs money and it's painful and there's no pleasure in it, because you're aware that the future pain avoidance is worth the pain and the energy. So this is the balancing act that the nervous system goes through in order to execute its best interest. All right, go ahead. Next slide, please. All right, so now here are these people, and we're going to call them, people in the blue, we're going to call them the Schmeisers. And I hope nobody out there's name is Schmeiser, because I just made this up. And Schmeisers have a ski shop in Lake Tahoe. And the people on the left there have a daughter named Kendall that wants to work at that ski shop. And you see the other people that get together in the background, they don't have daughters that want that job, so they don't have to talk to the Schmeisers, who are actually pretty boring people, and they wear matching monogram sweatshirts, which just tells you this is going to be a problem. And now you can see that we've got these other little people that are having to choke it out as the people in the green there are talking to the Schmeisers because they've got a daughter that wants to job at this cool ski shop. So our gal over here in the red hair is telling Ralph, listen, we've got to go over there and talk to them because we got to face this. And you know what? This is what human life is. Human life has a great many of these types of things that go on. You say, yeah, sure, boss, we'll get to it. Absolutely not a problem, etc. When you'd like to tell somebody, you know what, this is really not convenient for me. No, I don't think so. No, I think your request is unreasonable. We don't. We override these kinds of things all the time because we have willpower, in the sense that our brain can map out our best interest in the long term, and often will sacrifice short term without as much as a little bit of an annoyance and a little bit of override of energy and determination. So what I'm trying to say in all this is that actually we have plenty of willpower for the kinds of problems that human beings were naturally designed for. Our problems only come when we create unnatural problems, at which point then we're in trouble. Next slide, please. All right, and so we begin the story now about what willpower is by ending the first chapter, which is that human beings and other animals have the ability to override short-term lures and desires in order to execute their long-term best interest. there is no inherent shortage of willpower. However, we've seen that there are problems that are unnatural, which will challenge that limited ability. And so we can see that great people in history and all kinds of other people that we know, including ourselves, will struggle with this in the face of unnatural temptations. So now what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to make sure that the willpower that we do have gets nurtured and protected and defended against challenges that are self-destructive. In order to do that, we're going to look at the science of willpower, which is actually new. As important of a concept as this is, it has a surprisingly short history in science, and it's to that we're going to turn now. Next slide. All right, this is going to be the story of the research program of Professor Roy Baumeister. He's now at Florida State. He was at Case Western for many years. And all of the studies that I'm going to talk about here are not, were not just done by Baumeister, but they were inspired by Baumeister's work. And we're going to chart our way through the jungle here to an understanding of what willpower is. And beginning with the idea that it really wasn't under any scientific investigation until very recently. So we're going to begin with the very first and most famous study that Baumeister and his colleagues conducted, and we're going to see what a mystery was born out of this study. Next slide. All right, so we're going to talk about 5 studies. The most famous one is going to be cookies, and then there's going to be one on Mardi Gras, lemonade, dog treats, and then finally prisoners. So we're going to begin the story. These all link together. They're all influenced by each other. So we're going to begin with the famous cookie study. Next slide. All right, so here's the cookie study. Just to know that this is called experimental social psychology. And for those of you that remember Candid Camera, the guy who invented camera was a guy named Alan Funt, and he was had a master's degree in social psychology. He was trained by truly the master or the originator of experimental social psychology in the world. That this was a German or a European psychologist, Kurt Lewin, that had come over in the 1930s, and then essentially this concept was born. Instead of just observing people naturally in their interactions, Lewin had the idea of setting up experiments and interesting events to see what they would do. And of course, Candid Camera was the most famous of all these, setting up situations to surprise people and put them under unusual circumstances and watch their decision making, which was often hilarious. But this will look like Candid Camera, and so this is a classic experimental social psychology study. And so this is what they did was they had people fast for 3 hours, and then they had them come into the laboratory for what they thought was a taste study. And what they walked into was an experiment room that smelled like chocolate chip cookies had just been baked, which they had in a little oven right there in the experiment room. And there was a plate full of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, along with a bunch of chocolate candy sitting on a plate in a big pile. And next to it was a bowl full of radishes. And so they had to draw a straw out of a hat, and they either got the cookie condition or they got the radish condition. Now, if they got the cookie condition, they just sat down and ate as much as they wanted. The experimenter would leave the room, and then they would come back in and fill out a little form about what they thought of the taste. And that would be that. That's going to be part 1 of the study. It's a very tricky study. So the experiments, the subjects don't know what it is that they're getting into here. They don't know that, in fact, there's multiple parts of the study. They think that this is just all there is to it. Now, the exciting group is the group that draws the straw that says radish. And so they have to sit down in front of this bowl of radishes where right next to them is a plate full of cookies, and they're hungry. And the experimenter leaves the room and says, well, eat radishes for 10 minutes, and then I'll come back in, and you can rate the taste of the radishes. And of course, the stress is that they desperately want to eat those cookies, but they can't because it's against the rules. So there's a lot of close calls. There's people that would take the whole plate and put their nose right on top of it and sniff it. One guy dropped one of the cookies and it broke, and he had to put it back together. So they could see from a hidden camera that people were stressed, even though nobody chomped on any of the cookies or the candy. They wanted to, which is exactly what Baumeister had in mind when he set this thing up. So then what he did was he said, okay, thank you for your time, and thanks for filling out the forms. And now we're going to send you down the hallway because there's another study down the hallway. It has something to do with geometric intelligence. So just go down there and knock on door number 3 or whatever it is. So what's going to happen is that the people are going to go to the second study, and they think that these two studies are totally unrelated, but in fact they're integrated. And what they're going to do at the next study is that they're going to be shown some figure drawings that look like you could draw them and not lift your pencil. And they're told, okay, your job is to figure out how to reproduce this drawing without lifting your pencil. And so we're really studying geometric intelligence here. And so we're going to leave you alone in this room with a stack of paper. And as soon as you figure it out, then ring this bell, because I'm going to be timing you to see how fast you can do this. And oh, by the way, there's some people that get stumped and can't figure it out. And if you're one of those people, just work until you feel like you can't do it. And then when you are sure that you can't do it, then ring the bell and I'll come in. So what this is it's actually going to study how long and tenaciously people work at a problem, because the truth is that the problem cannot be solved. So it looks like it can be solved, but it cannot be solved. And Baumeister has the intuition that if people had to be in the radish condition in part 1 and wanted the cookies but couldn't get them, his intuition was that if they went to the second study and they had been in the radish condition, then they would not work as long at the problems before they quit as a person who had gotten eaten the cookies. This was his idea. I have no idea why he came up with this idea, but he did. And so go ahead, next slide, we're going to take a look at it. Okay, so here's step 1. That's the stress test, where the person either gets cookies or they have to face radishes, or they get neither. They just get handed a magazine and told to read a magazine for 10 minutes. Step 2 is they go down the hallway, and you can see what we call the null hypothesis in science, is how long it's going to take these people before they quit trying on this figure drawing. And the notion would be that all 3 conditions would go about the same length. That's not what happened. What happened is that in the radish condition, people only went for 8 minutes before they gave up. This is really interesting. So if you, in condition 1, you had gotten to eat cookies, you went 20 minutes before you picked up the little bell in the second part of the study and said, hey, I can't figure out the figure drawing. But if you were the person in the radish condition, you only went 8 minutes. This, surprisingly, it's about the same length of time that you sat in that room and stared at those cookies and had to eat radishes and wanted the cookies. So this was a very interesting finding, and Baumeister didn't know why it was happening. He had suspected that it would happen, and he actually had, when he wrote this up, he said, we don't know what to call this, and we don't know what it is. But in honor of Freud, he called it ego depletion. Remember, ego is the rider of the horse of the id, and he says, okay, we're going to use Freudian terms for just a minute for fun. The ego, or the rider, gets tired and it gets depleted, and then it just doesn't have any more juice in it. And that's where he came up with that term, and he published that in 1999 and opened up the world of psychology to trying to figure out what on earth is ego depletion and how does it work and why. Okay, next slide. All right, so they tried to figure this out, and many laboratories in the country were trying to figure it out. And Baumeister himself finally came up with an idea. He thought that maybe when you got pleasured, it steeled you up to face things, to face hard problems. So maybe in the first study, the magazine group did fine, but they weren't hungry. So it's going to turn out that in the first group, remember, the people that got the cookies, maybe that pleasure sort of buffered them and got them ready to put up with a bunch of stress. And he thought, maybe that's what Mardi Gras is like. So people are going to go into Lent, where they're going to have to give something up for a period of time. And so maybe that's why they have this wild party beforehand, to pleasure themselves, to get ready for being, abstaining from things. And so this is called the Mardi Gras study. So the Mardi Gras study, what they're going to do is they're going to have 3 conditions. It's going to be a milkshake. A person's going to get either a pleasurable milkshake, a really gunky thing to eat, or a magazine. And then they're going to have to go do those figure drawings. But before we do those figure drawings, what we're going to do is we're going to stress them first, then give them either the milkshake or the chunky shake or the magazine, and then we're going to test how long they do those figure drawings again. So the way they're going to stress people is going to be through what's called a 4-color test. Go ahead, next slide, please. So this is, they'll flash on a screen in part 1 of the study, like the word green, except it might be in red, or it might be in green, or it might be in blue. And you have to very quickly decide whether it's congruent or not congruent. Turns out it's really hard for people to do this, because when you see the word green, you're thinking green, and then you're not sure, wait a second, is that green or not green? Different areas of the brain are having to make those distinctions, and it's really hard, and it'll give you a headache pretty quick. So that's what they did to stress people. And then in a second study down the hallway, then they went and they did this other thing. They either had a very tasty shake, or a terrible shake, or a magazine. And then step 3 was to do the puzzle drawings and see how long they would go before they would quit. And so they expected that the people that got pleasured at step 2 would do really well, and then that the people that ate the junky, terrible tasting milkshake would do poorly, and the people that got the magazine would do poorly. So they expected high, low, low. All right, go ahead. This next slide, please. This is what they found. So they found that the people that had gotten the milkshake at stage 2 did very well, and so did the people that ate the junky stuff. But the people that had the magazine handed to them did poorly in stage 3, or the figure drawings. This was a total puzzle, and Baumeister had no idea what was going on. And they were frustrated, because his theory of pleasure being a buffer against stress just went down the drain here. And the only thing that they could think of that was the cause would be that the people ate something. So Baumeister thought, is it possible that calories is the power in willpower? And in fact, maybe it's blood sugar being replaced in the brain. And so he does another study in order to look at this, and we're going to now look at this now. Go ahead, next slide. So what he does is he does the same kind of study that he just did with the junky milkshake, except he replaces it with real lemonade with sugar versus fake lemonade that's just as pleasurable but no sugar, and a magazine. So once again, what the study's going to be is the subjects are going to be at step 1, they're going to do that 4-color test, and they're going to be kind of mentally exhausted. Then at step 2, they're going to get either a real lemonade where there's real sugar in it, or fake lemonade, or a magazine. And then the third stage, they're going to go down the hallway, go into the thing that says geometric intelligence, be handed a sheet and say, try to reproduce this drawing, and ring the little bell when you give up. And we're going to find out how long people go before they give up. And in this case, the hypothesis is that the people that get the real lemonade will do well, and that the other two people other two groups will do poorly because they didn't get any sugar. Next slide, please. And this is exactly what they find. So in the Baumeister lab, they see that the power in willpower is sugar, which quite frankly shouldn't surprise us people, that the brain is running on glucose. And so when it works hard, it burns itself through some glucose, and it actually is dipping in the blood sugar in certain areas of the brain. It's tired, and it takes some time for that to be replenished. And if they use something like a simple sugar, which can hit the bloodstream very quickly, it's not ideal for brain power, but it's perfect for experiments. So if we use something like an unprotected no-fiber sugar like lemonade, and boom, we immediately get sugar into the system, then what happens is that the person recovers very well. When they got lemonade that didn't have any calories in it, they did not recover, and they did not recover, obviously, with a magazine. So this is a fantastic discovery, and Baumeister then goes around the country to universities explaining what is that he did. So essentially, he recovers the ego power by replacing calories. Go ahead, next slide, please. And so he talks like a psychologist, like, well, the ego depletion is, replaced by nutrition, and therefore, this is how we're going to improve functioning. So sitting in one of his lectures at the University of Kentucky, when he's there, is a little gal named Holly Miller. And she's listened to this kind of talk before out of psychologists. She's actually a grad student studying dog psychology. And she feels like she always hates all these psychological terms because she thinks it's just physiological, a great deal of what human beings go through. Go ahead, next slide, please. And so what Holly does is decide to replicate the Baumeister study, and she's going to do it with her dogs. So one of them there is named Spot, the other one is named Spots, and she has some other dogs too. And they all love Holly, and she's going to take them through the Baumeister study in the dog world. Go ahead, next slide. And so the stress, instead of a 4-color test, the way she's going to stress her dogs is by having them on a little blanket in the room, and they don't get to come over to see her. They have to stay for 10 minutes. That's going to stress a dog out. And so that's the replication of the part of the study when people are staring at cookies but have to eat radishes. Okay, next slide. In the control condition, the dog gets to stay in a cage with Holly in there, so the dog is not as stressed because the dog isn't having to constantly override its impulses to run over. Next slide. So then the way after she stresses the dog, then she's going to give them a puzzle. So obviously they can't do a figure drawing, but they can open a puzzle called a tug-a-jug, which is a little dog toy that has a treat located in it, and all of Holly's dogs were trained and had experience in opening tug-a-jugs. So she's now going to give them a tug-a-jug that has a flaw in it, and you can't open it. And we're going to find out how long the dogs work at the tug-a-jug before they quit. Go ahead, next slide, please. So this is what she finds. She finds that the dogs that were sitting in the room with her and had to stay for 10 minutes, those dogs, when she gave them a tug-a-jug that was rigged, quit sooner, quite a bit sooner than the dogs that had been in the cage. So this is a perfect conceptual replication of the Baumeister study. And so Holly Miller follows up Baumeister by saying, yes, what willpower is it's actually a physiological event that's taking place in the brain. We don't have to use a word like ego depletion. If you can, if you want, but this is basic animal nervous system limitations. And this is how stress is going to work. And it's going to cause creatures to quit on difficult problems once they are mentally tired. Very, very important research. Go ahead, next slide, please. She then stresses them out, and then gives them some sugary lemonade in between, literally lemonade, and they recover beautifully, just as would have been anticipated by looking at the Baumeister studies. Go ahead, next slide, please. Now, I spent about 10 years of my life working in high security prisons. And it turns out that in prisons, nobody else knew that I was a health psychologist on the outside. And it turns out that they bring donuts into prisons a lot. And so I could walk by the break room and there'd be donuts there. And so I could eat donuts and nobody would think anything of it. So in prison, I was a free man. And there was a problem with the donuts. Next slide. Sometimes the donuts would jump out of the box. I don't know why they would do this, but they would sometimes jump out of the box and land in my mouth through no fault of my own. So this is now the story of how we're going to solve the problem of jumping donuts, which is really the willpower problem. All right, next slide. All right, so our last study that we're going to look at is going to be the parole board. So this was the final study we're talking about, and it was inspired by Baumeister's work, but was not done by him. It was done by people at the University of Illinois who had data that they could mine from a parole board in Israel. And this parole board in Israel would meet normal business hours all year long, and they would hear cases. And they would make decisions about who to let out and who not to let out. And on average, they would parole about 35% of people. Now, what this group from Illinois did was they went into the record and they collapsed over the course of a year all of the cases and plotted them against a day. So all of the cases that were heard at 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, noon, after lunch, etc. And if it were the case that justice was being meted out by the board, then your odds of being paroled if you had a 9 o'clock case should be the same as if you had a 2 o'clock case. Go ahead, next slide, please. So if justice were the case, when we looked at these 1,000 cases, say, it should all look completely even if we collapse that year's worth of work, superimpose them on a day. That's provided, of course, that there's no rule that says we hear the axe murders in the morning and we hear the parking ticket people in the afternoon. It turns out that the cases, in terms of their severity, were absolutely randomly distributed throughout the day, of course. And so at the end of the year, you have a perfect random assignment condition where essentially, if there's anything about this graph that doesn't look like this, we're going to smell a rat. So people that have been with us this long in this presentation should suspect that there's likely to be a rat here, which is going to mean that these judges are going to be getting periodically exhausted and they're going to get more impulsive and they're not going to make just decisions. Go ahead and next slide, please. So one hypothesis that the authors did not say that I said when I first read the study, I thought, you know what, I'll bet the judges, when they're not as tired, they consider more factors and they think it through and they're more likely probably to let people go. But as they get tired during the day, they're going to get more impulsive and they're going to get, they want a quicker decision, and the quick decision will always be, oh, just keep them in. Because that's the decision that doesn't take as much effort, there's less risk involved with it. It turns out that they did study paroles versus non-paroles, and it was true that when they decided to not parole people, the decisions were much shorter. They used far less words to describe the decision. In other words, less mental effort was being put in. Now, the question, that wouldn't be important to us if it turned out that the decision line was the blue line. It was if they were meting out justice beautifully all day long, and the time of day didn't make any impact on their decision making, then it would simply be the case that shorter decisions were indicative of a simpler case that we could simply say no. But of course, the outcome line does not look like the blue line, and in fact, it doesn't even look like the red line that I thought. If it did look like the red line, notice what a horrible miscarriage of justice would be going on, where if your odds of going home were 45% at 8 a.m., but 25% at 4 p.m., that means that's a really bad shake. if you happen to have the after lunch slot. Now we're going to look at what the actual data showed from the study that was done at the University of Illinois. Go ahead, next slide. This is actually what happened. So if you had the first case of the day, your odds of going home were 70%. If you were a little bit later in the morning, your odds went down to 10%. If it was right before, actually, then the judges go out for a break and they get a snack and they come back in and your next odds are 70%. But if you're heard right before lunch, the odds are that you're not going to go home are astronomically against you. If you're right after lunch, you're fine. If you're in mid-afternoon, you're dead in the water. This is an extraordinary study that shows us that human decision-making is enormously subject to the short-term mental state of the brain. This is like a travesty of justice here. And I want you to realize you are now looking at human willpower. So human willpower isn't what we thought, which is this characteristic of a person that transcends day and time and sleep deprivation and everything else under the sun. In fact, your willpower is bouncing around considerably all day long as an individual. And so this is why, for example, in AA, they call it HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. When you stress the system, it becomes much less robust with respect to willpower challenges. And that's really a problem when those willpower challenges are involve supernormal stimuli like junky food, alcohol, cigarettes, etc., things like that. Okay, so now we're going to go to the next slide. So now people say, okay, well, what's the great willpower secret? How can I not self-sabotage? How can I stay on a healthy track? Well, we already know that your motivational system was not designed to consistently make excellent decisions in the face of supernormal stimuli. So it's hard to do any health promoting program well. But there's certain habits that we can use that will make it more likely for us to be successful more often. And here they are. Go ahead, next slide. First thing you want to do is clean your room. You want a clean, orderly environment to live in. The reason is that if you have chaos around you, your mind is working extra hard just looking at a mess. It's trying to think through what priorities it should do first, where that missing telephone bill is. In other words, everything is causing you a great deal more effort mentally when you have a disorderly environment. One of the best things that you can do to improve your general willpower functioning is to have a neat, orderly environment that makes you stronger in the face of temptation. Go ahead, next slide. The next thing you can do, you can notice that this is actually the same bedroom as was in the previous slide because it's the same red plant. We're just seeing this now from a different perspective as the brilliant artist is now taking you 90 degrees and you're sitting on the bed looking at this. Now, this is what we lay out as our exercise clothes because our job is going to be to get, say, 10 or 15 minutes of exercise a day. We want to do this for a variety of reasons. One of them is we believe it helps support our willpower. That we think, but we don't know. That people that exercise regularly, and it doesn't have to be a lot. You could put on a couple of dance tunes and just dance around and get yourself a little bit winded. But the notion here is to put yourself in a situation where the body has to kick out some extra glycogen as you start running yourself down a little bit of blood sugar. We think that may be, as the liver gets better at releasing glycogen, that could be a reason why people that exercise regularly have better willpower in general, because essentially when they need it, they can get to extra energy better. Okay, so next slide, please. Now, when the donuts are flying all around you and they're trying to get into you, what you want to do is you want to stick something in your mouth first. So I would tell myself at the prison, you have to go eat something healthy first before you go back around and look at those donuts. And very often, if I would go and eat something, if I'd stick an apple in my mouth to open, close up the space, what would happen is that this now supports my willpower. And now it's like, it's just not as enticing. And so it's not always going to work, and it's not always going to be a complete solution. But we should have a simple rule that if you're about to eat something junky, realize you must eat something healthy first, and then we'll see whether or not it has such appeal. Okay, and next slide, please. And finally, we want to go to bed on time. It's going to turn out that we now know from studies that have been done in the last 20 years that adequate sleep is an extremely important feature in willpower. If it turns out that people that will sleep 6 hours a week instead of 8 hours, 6 hours a night instead of 8 hours, will have a substantially greater tendency to eat junk food, and will typically eat about 300 calories more a day than somebody that's sleeping 8 hours. We get more impulsive. The brain is essentially dirty. It's not functioning very well. We don't get a full cleaning job. It's kind of like a cheap cleaning job at the car wash. You want to get the premium job at the car wash to have the car really clean. If you do not sleep to satiety, you are cheating the mind of cleaning itself out. That turns out to be a major feature of what is happening during our sleep. Every animal on the earth, literally down to the smallest little tiny creature, sleeps. Every one of them that has ever been studied. There's no creature, there's no animal that does not sleep. We are the only species that willfully shorts ourselves of sleep. And when we do that, we pay the price. Our mental functioning drops. We are operating on a handicapped basis. And one of the things that will be handicapped will be our willpower. So that's why we want to make really good quality sleep, as much as you can. In other words, people ask how much should they sleep? The answer is as much as you want. That's what it should be. We want to be sleeping to satiation as many nights out of 7 as you can. Next slide, please. And so these are the great willpower secrets from the great Swami here. Are incredibly simple. They're very basic hygiene. Clean your room, exercise, have healthy food and snacks available, and get a good night's sleep. These things are really basic processes that turn out to help our willpower be as strong as it needs to be so that we don't wind up being compromised and getting it challenged. Next slide, please. There's always going to be problems. There's going to be a project you need to stay up late for, and we're not going to get good sleep. We're going to be around a place where donuts are flying and there's no healthy food around. We're always going to wind up in compromised situations. And so every now and then a weed is going to start growing in our garden. A bad habit is going to start. Our job is to return to these fundamentals and pull the weeds. If we return consistently, exercise, sleep, healthy food, orderly environment, if we keep returning to these fundamentals, then what's going to happen is that we can keep the weeds down to a sane and reasonable level. And in that way, they don't take over the garden. We know what happens when life gets out of balance and any of these things gets crazy. Our willpower goes out the window, and so does our health program. Next slide. And so this is how it is, folks, that the willpower problem can be viewed as a essential mental hygiene exercise that keeps us in a place where we can have the life we deserve. All right. All right. So hopefully that's a good introduction to this for people, and some tips about how what to take away to implement in your life to give yourself the edge that you need.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Lisle. Brilliant presentation. Dr. Lisle, we don't have a lot of time left for questions, but we will. I would like to ask you one question that came up several times, and then maybe for next month we could make a willpower Q&A. What do you think?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So everybody, if you would like to send us questions, the questions you can email to webinar@drmcdougall.com. But Dr. Lisle, if you could just touch on this topic about sabotage sabotaging, and when it happens, or why, or how can people overcome this issue?
Yes, there's many reasons for this, and that I've discussed in other webinars. So sometimes we self-sabotage because we're so frustrated that the expectations that we have of ourselves, or that other people may quietly have transmitted to us, we feel like we can't reach them, and we sort of kick over the table. And so I discussed that in detail in the January 2016 webinar that you and I did, called The Slow Fast Way. So that's one very important issue. But what we talk about today is also involved. People can get overwhelmed because they're disorganized. They try to learn too much and try to cook too many new things, and their kitchen's a mess and it's not organized. What we want to do is keep things simple. Okay? We want to do very simple, good things over and over again. Simple exercise program, simple dietary program. Get to bed on time. Okay? Have snacks available for us that are healthy, so that they are our go-to moves when we're being challenged or we're hungry. These are in between meals. These are the things that we need to do. I believe that a lot of the problems come when people overly complicate this thing, and they try to do too much, and then they get overwhelmed, and then they just shrug their shoulders and kick over the table and quit. Keep it simple. What we need to do for this program is we need to institute what I call the starch stream. You better know how you're getting a stream of starches into your life. It's the #1 problem that you have, and we've got to solve it. So if you have an oven that you could cook 10 baked potatoes at a time, do it. If you could make one big crock pot full of a big vegetable stew that you can eat on all week and get several meals out of it, that's a good thing. If you can eat oatmeal in the morning, a lot of mornings, if not all, then this is a whole slew of the starch stream. So we just need to solve the problem with the starch stream, and we need to exercise, keep an orderly environment, get to sleep on time. This is a group of techniques that will help get us into what I call a good groove. And one day that groove can get deep, and then you're in a deep groove where you just do things right all the time, and life is easy. In other words, this can become an easy program, but only after you get good at managing these miniature or smaller problems and get up the learning curve so they're simple. Fantastic, Gustavo. Great to see you again.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.